Hi, everybody. This is Tim Garner again, and this is week 5 of our overview study of the book of Deuteronomy. So let's get going. Let me share my screen. And get this little out of the way here. All right, so the theme verse for this week really comes from Deuteronomy 14 and verse 2. Again, all under the heading of the idea of Hear, O Israel. This week, the emphasis is on you are chosen out of all peoples. In fact, it says, the Lord has chosen you to be a people for his own possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. Certainly the Lord wants us to know that we should feel special, but not because we have any specific value over and above any other people, but because God loves us so much and he values us and wants to extend his love and grace to us. And of course, the balance verse for this is Romans 12 and verse 3, where Paul says after the be transformed, not conformed verses in verse 1 and 2, he says, for through the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you not to think more highly of himself than he ought to think, but to think so as to have sound judgment, as God has allotted to each a measure of faith. So let's get right into it. So here's the outline of the book that we've been looking at, and the area that we're in right now is in Moses' second sermon, which is an introspective sermon, where he wants us to look within and understand and internalize what God expects of us. And here's the more detailed outline that we've been using as well. So the first section we've dealt with is what God has done for Israel in the historical section really of the book. And we started on the idea of what God expects of Israel in the legal aspect of the book. And then we covered, or will cover in the future, what God will do for Israel in the prophetic part of the book toward the end. But the section we're in now is the explanation of the additional laws that he's going to get into after the restatement of the Ten Commandments. And specifically today, we're in the section where we're talking about explanations or expansions on the ceremonial laws. So basically, the book breaks down, if we wanted to turn it into a sermon that we might use contemporarily. It's dedicated to worshiping only the Lord in chapter 13, dedicated to understanding and following food laws and generosity in chapter 14, dedicated to applying all these things in good relationships, not only in society, but interpersonal relationships, and dedicated to gathering for worship, in the principle of in the place that God chooses, that kind of thing. So under the heading of dedication, this comic may really only be indirectly related to the idea of dedication, but it just somehow seems appropriate right now. The gentleman is sitting there and he basically asks his wife, it looks like, he says, I can't remember, do I work at home or do I live at work? And I'm not sure how that exactly goes to the idea of dedication in this passage, but it just certainly seems appropriate just now. And of course, that's the kind of decisions that we have to make every day, whether it's at work or in our daily lives in following Jesus, being disciples of Jesus. So right into it, Deuteronomy chapter 13 basically says we're not to follow the words of a false prophet into idolatry. So specifically, if a prophet should try to lead us astray from worshiping God, the Israelites are being told don't. And in fact, there should be very severe consequences, and we'll come back to those as we go along. The next one is do not follow the advice of a family or friend. So if a loved one should try to lead you astray, to follow strange new gods is how he puts it there in verse 7, then don't again. And in fact, do not follow the example of entire cities. If an entire city should go astray, into idolatry, following strange new gods, we're not to do it. And in fact, we need to understand that a lot of times these contacts and experiences that we have are intended to be growth experiences to test us. God has actually given us an opportunity to grow and shun the things that are idolatrous, that are immoral, that will lead us astray. Of course, there's the issue of why is the punishment so harsh? We'll get into that, as I say, as we go along. But looking further into chapter 13, we must be proactive in eliminating quote-unquote sin from the camp. We see this multiple times in the book of Joshua as well. And as harsh as it was, really the death penalty in this particular passage served three purposes. It practically removed the evil, it deterred others from wrongdoing, and it turned away or assuaged God's wrath. So why was the punishment so harsh? Why was phraseology like devoted to destruction used? Well, first of all, we have to remember the depths to which the Canaanites had fallen in societal and religious depravity. So much so that 400 plus years before that, Genesis 15 and verse 16, God's already watching. And he's talking about how the sin of the Amorites is not yet full. And he's already said that part of the purpose of the blessing of the people to go and occupy the land, they'll be blessed by that. But part of the God's purpose is not just to bless them, but also to punish the Amorites or the Canaanites. And then, of course, we saw in Deuteronomy chapter 12 and verse 31, it says, "You shall not behave thus toward the Lord your God, for every abominable act which the Lord hates, they have done for their gods." And I won't get into how depraved those acts are, but he basically tops it off by saying, "For they even burn their sons and daughters in the fire to their gods." So we can kind of see the depths to which they've gone, and that kind of helps us understand just how severe these punishments really were. So as we look at it, as we look at this idea, God says, whoever sacrifices to any god, this is in the same vicinity, by the way, in Exodus, just after the law was given, the Ten Commandments. Whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord alone shall be devoted to. And then, of course, there's a generic use or a general use of this. Anything devoted to destruction is most holy to the Lord. It's been set apart for the Lord. Just a usage idea there. And then in the book that we're studying now, we captured all the cities. This is a recounting of the history of their conquering of some of the cities there. It says we captured all his cities at that time and devoted to destruction every city, men, women, and children. We left no survivors. And of course, we'll see that as we go along. And he says, "You shall not bring an abominable thing into your house and become yourselves devoted to destruction. You shall utterly detest it, abhor it, shun it, stay away from it, for it is devoted to destruction." And of course, then we see examples of how that was to be done. On the heels of the attempt to take the city of Ai, there was in fact sin in the camp. And they were not to take any of the things that were to be devoted to destruction. He says in so many words, "I will not be with you anymore unless you destroy whatever among you is devoted to destruction." So apparently it was a really big deal, especially in this time, in that time and in that place, for the purpose that God had in mind for the people there. So then as we get into chapter 14, we see God's children should act like God the Father. They should be holy like the Lord is holy. And this is a theme that goes all through the New Testament, or the Old as well as the New Testament in regard to his people. We're supposed to remember that we were chosen out of the world for his possession. The Israelites were told the same thing. And of course, in leading into that chapter, he mentions a couple of things that have to do with how they're supposed to present themselves. He says, "You shall not round off the side growth of your beards." This is Leviticus 19, verse 27. "Nor harm the edges of your beard. You shall not make any cuts in your body for the dead, nor make any tattoo marks on yourselves. I am the Lord. I am Jehovah." And in chapter 21 of Leviticus, he says, they shall not make any baldness on their heads, nor shave off the edge of their beards, or make any cuts in their flesh. And of course, this is always in the context of they shall be holy, special, set apart to their God, and not profane the name of their God. Apparently, the practice of the pagan peoples was to practice a lot of these physical alterations. So as we go on, clean and unclean food restrictions are offered in verse 3 through 21. There's clean and unclean land animals, those that divide the hoof and chew the cud are acceptable. Then there are clean and unclean water creatures. Basically, the description there is fins and scales. And then there's an involved list of clean and unclean air creatures. And then, of course, as we look at this, we need to understand that a lot of this goes away when we get to the New Testament. Jesus himself says, do you not understand that whatever goes into the man, this is Mark chapter 7, into the man from outside cannot defile him? Because it doesn't go into his heart, but into his stomach, and it's eliminated. And in that statement there, it says, thus he declared all foods clean. So basically, the clean and unclean concept of the food itself Jesus is basically fulfilling, removing, explaining that away. And then, of course, in Romans chapter 14, verse 1 through 12, specifically in verse 6, he says, he who observes the day observes it for the Lord, and he who eats does so for the Lord, for he gives thanks to God. And he who eats not for the Lord, he does not eat, he gives thanks to God. For not one of us lives to himself, and not one dies to himself. And then basically, after all these things that are basically issues of discretion or not issues of faith or spiritual issues, he says, so then each one of us will give an account of himself to God. So we have to act based on our conscience. And then, of course, there's Colossians 2, verse 16 and 17, right on the heels of verse 14, where it says that all of the issues of the law and the ordinances related to it were nailed to Jesus' cross. He then says, therefore, no one is to act as your judge in regard to food or drink, or in respect to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath day, things which are a mere shadow of what is to come. But the substance, he says, belongs to Christ. And then, of course, as we get further into the passage, we see that the idea of Israel is supposed to give or tithe as part of fearing the Lord, both to the Levites who had no part in the nation, no particular material part, and anyone who had need. They're not supposed to eat anything dead of itself. And then also there's sort of a quick mention there of you shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk, which seems sort of obtuse and obscure, but it's actually mentioned twice in Exodus 23:19. And just real quickly, basically this has generated over the centuries, especially in Judaism, three basic ideas. It forbids Jews to cook meat and milk together. They don't eat meat that was cooked with milk, and they're not supposed to receive any benefit from such a combination or concoction. And this probably had something to do with any one or all of the following. It was probably connected in the place where they were going to idolatrous or occult practices. It could have been an idea of the cruelty or contempt for the parent, the mother and the child, the kid and the goat mother. It was certainly inadvisable for digestive reasons. Some believed and have written that it profaned the Feast of Ingathering. And of course, then it had sort of an Epicurean or overindulgent idea to it. So moving into chapter 15, so every 7 years, debts were remitted. They were canceled. They were released for neighbors and relatives. And the generosity, of course, that they're supposed to exhibit in their relationships meant that in those blessings, they will lend but not borrow. They will rule but not be ruled, he says there in verse 6. Their attitude, verse 7 through 11, was They were supposed to be helping the poor. Let's get ahead here. Okay. They were to remember the poor and needy and do not withhold their hand or generosity from them, the hand being a metaphor for the generosity. Employers were to treat their employees properly, and I put those in quotes just because that's going to generate some discussion for us momentarily. And then finally, they were to offer up to God their first and best. So the whole idea here is every 7 years, if a poor fellow Israelite had indentured themselves or contracted themselves to a wealthier Israelite, then they were to be released from that contract, those obligations. Not only were they released, but they were sent away with material goods, material wealth. And so in light of that, we need to answer the question here that everybody will ask when they get to this passage is, really two questions. Is biblical slavery the same as recent slavery? And in thinking about that, does the Bible condone slavery? And I'll just say up front, unequivocally, the answer is no. So first of all, we need to look at the idea that the Bible condemns the slave trade, right? Exodus 21, also in the same neighborhood as the Ten Commandments. He who kidnaps a man, whether he sells him or is found in his possession, shall surely be put to death. So for the slave trader, it was the death sentence. And in Deuteronomy 24, later on in the book, if a man is caught kidnapping any of his countrymen of the sons of Israel, he deals with him violently or sells him, then that thief shall die. So you shall purge the evil from among you. Apparently, they look down on what we'll see in just a moment as kidnap slavery. So, and then in the New Testament, kidnappers, men stealers, as your King James will say, is put right in the same company with the unholy, profane, immoral, homosexuals, liars, perjurers, and so on. So obviously, it would not have been condoned in the sense that we've seen it in the last 1,000 years or so. So exactly what are we talking about then? So the kind of slavery that we often think about is what we can call kidnap slavery. That's what we've seen for the last 1,000 or so years. And really more recently in our country, and honestly, it's unfortunately still prevalent today. And then there's the kind of slavery that went on all through history, and it's the spoils of war slavery. It's where a land's laid waste, the vanquished basically are left to rely on whatever generosity was being offered by the victor. And here, in places such as Deuteronomy and other places in the Old Testament, basically that generosity to the vanquished is encouraged, it's enhanced, and it's regulated. But now what we're talking about here is really something different. It's voluntary servitude, voluntary servanthood. And another way that we've seen it in recent history, it's referred to as indentured service, or even contract labor. You fulfill a contract, you move on. But it has laws, it has regulations, it has rules. And the employer or the master, if you will, has to follow those laws and rules. All right. So then in chapter 16, we see a beginning of the discussion of feasts and their relationship in worship. In verse 1 through 8, the Passover, and then the soon following, the feast that follows, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Bread was a time to remember Israel's deliverance from bondage. The whole practice itself was kind of a reenactment, if you will, of their deliverance from bondage. And of course, the beautiful metaphor there for us is that Jesus is our Passover. Paul actually uses it in a passage where he's dealing with some really difficult moral subjects. And he says, do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Clean out the old leaven so that you may be a new lump, just as you are in fact unleavened. For Christ, our Passover, also has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us celebrate the feast not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So then further on in the chapter, the Feast of Weeks, what they called Pentecost, was a time of Israel's thankfulness, 49 or so days after Passover. And then the Feast of Tabernacles was supposed to be a time to remember God's provision for Israel in the wilderness. And basically that chapter also mentions the idea that they're supposed to, 3 times a year, all the males were supposed to appear before the Lord. Those were the big 3, I guess you could say. And then toward the end of the chapter, it talks about, as you move into chapter 17, it talks about purity and justice and purity in worship, removing idolatry and so on. So there's remembering one's deliverance from bondage helps keep one faithful to God, whether it's the material bondage that they underwent or the spiritual bondage that all humankind experiences because of sin. And we are to give back generously to God, whatever we're able, and as we've been prospered, certainly as a principle. It was stated very concretely in the Old Testament, and it's a principle for us today. God demands righteous and fair judgment. The Lord hates idolatry. He's been saying that over and over again in the book of Deuteronomy, and will continue to say it. And then here is a kind of an analysis of the feasts. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail with this, but if you look at the red on the right, you can see all of the feasts that are covered in the book of Deuteronomy. Chapter 5, of course, the Sabbath, is mentioned in the restatement of the law. And then, of course, there's the Passover, the unleavened bread feast. They're right there together. And then Pentecost and the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths, is mentioned. And then there's the other books, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, that cover these. If you want this slide, again, I encourage you to get in touch with me. Send a note to that email at the bottom of the screen there, and I will send this slide over to you gladly. And same thing here, kind of a different analysis, but this is sort of the New Testament applications to these particular, to the feasts. And you can see we've already talked about the Passover in 1 Corinthians 5. Hebrews chapter 9, verse 9 and 10 talks about and uses multiple figures or metaphors of the Day of Atonement. But the big thing is that we need to realize in Colossians 2 and Hebrews 8, Hebrews 10, that those material things, those symbols and acts and processes that they followed back then, were intended to be a mere shadow of what is to come, Colossians 2:17. They were to serve, Hebrews 8:5, as a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. So they were to bring us into a spiritual understanding, or lead us to a spiritual understanding of the sacrifice that ultimately Jesus and finally Jesus made for all of us. So on the heading of dedication or devotion, so here's Charlie Brown saying, our first game of the season, what do we need to win? And Lucy immediately says, courage, fortitude, and dedication. Charlie Brown says, how did you know that? Lucy says, I wrote down what you said last year, which I guess is something we all should do. But for the purposes of the comic, it's just intended to be funny. So, in summary, chapter 13, the Israelites are encouraged to be dedicated to worshiping only the Lord. Chapter 14, they're being taught to be dedicated and follow food laws and understand the rules or the need for generosity. And they're to be dedicated to following God's law, God's will in regard to good relationships. And they're to be dedicated to gathering for worship. I hope this has been edifying for you. Blessings to you in the rest of your week. Bye for now.